Lecture 6, 1st of December 19601. Last time I talked about the peculiar ambiguity that belongs to being, on the one hand, as a concept, covering all of the beings that it encompasses, and, on the other, as an abstract and merely negative expression for what is not itself conceptual. And I traced this ambiguity briefly in relation to one or two models from ancient philosophy where this double sense, and not simply the so-called problem of being as such, was also to be found. In this context I briefly discussed the problem of being in Plato, namely the being of the ideas which stood in such contrast to non-being, tau mu nu, to meon, even if, with various concessions, the latter still had to be addressed after all. And here I should just mention a structure which did not come up explicitly in Plato last time but which is so familiar from the history of philosophy that I am sure I hardly need to draw your attention to it. I am talking about the concept of mu theta epsilon xi iota sigma, methexis, namely the participation of the many disparate things and the ideas, a doctrine which only makes sense of course if the realm of beings is not simply defined as utter non-being in relation to genuine being. And I pursued this back even further to the enigmatic fracture or duality, or however you want to describe it, within the didactic poem of Parmenides. Let me just add here that, even in Aristotle, who effectively provides the model for the philosophy of being in the emphatic sense, namely for the question of what being really is, this peculiar alternation between being and beings can be found in his concept of pyro tau eta omicron sigma alpha, protalgia, or primary substance, as that which preeminently has being. For this pyro tau eta omicron sigma alpha, protalgia, appears in Aristotle in two quite different and, we might say, entirely contradictory senses. And the contradiction would appear so flagrant that we should have to charge the first great teacher of logic with an elementary error in this very field if this same ambiguity did not actually reveal the much deeper problem of the concept of being or of being itself. For, on the one hand, in Aristotle, this pyro tau eta omicron sigma alpha, protalgia, the first or primary being that exists, is supposed to be the same as the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, the this there, the individuated singular thing that is immediately given to me here and now in space and time. We should point out, incidentally, that this expression tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, for the this there, for thisness, as it were, is a fundamental expression for the entire history of philosophy. And those of you who are just beginning to study philosophy, for whom these lectures may also serve as a kind of introduction to the subject, would do well to familiarize yourselves with these terms, which, like all of Aristotle's terminology, effectively represent a model of philosophical terminology in general. Thus the concept of haixi, the this there, in scholastic philosophy is a direct translation of tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, and the famous Scotist expression haxiitis, or thisness, namely the principium individuationis in addition to essence and existence, is actually nothing but the hypostasis of this Aristotelian concept. Needless to say, this concept of the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, the specific individuated this there, the individual thing or appearance that presents itself before our eyes, refers to beings or entities and not to being. For what lies closest, as it were, actually corresponds to tau nu tau alpha, ta anta, to the individual and specific things that exist, not to any underlying structure of being as such, whatever it may be. In view of the emphatic concept of being which I have talked about, you will naturally ask how it is possible that Aristotle initially introduces being in the form of beings or entities in this way, and that this kind of being is even presented as constitutive. Now this is actually not that hard to understand if you just recall for a moment how I tried to show you that the concept of being is itself mediated, in other words, that it is an abstraction with respect to the particular beings from which it derives. But please do not misunderstand me here, for I was not trying to claim that being is nothing but such an abstraction. I was trying to show that this very moment of the non-conceptual, which is indicated by the concept being, actually points towards something which, precisely because it is not conceptual, cannot itself be abstract either. On the other side, however, we have already described the mechanism of abstraction as constitutive for the possibility, for the meaningful constitution, of being. And, if that is so, beings would indeed, in this sense, be prior with respect to being, just as we find with the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, in Aristotle. Now you can see here how the distinctive Eleatic and Platonic dualism, or the Eleatic and Platonic ambivalence with regard to being, still reaches into the purest philosophy of the Greek Enlightenment. For in addition to this interpretation of tau nu, ta'on, or beings, of pyro tau eta omicron sigma alpha, protalgia, as the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, we also find a doctrine that is directly opposed to it, the authentically Platonic doctrine of the priority of the idea, the priority of the concept, over against the individual things that are encompassed by it. These two opposed conceptions of what is first or primary, of the pyro tau omicron nu, proton, in Aristotle are possible, and Aristotle's philosophy is certainly prima philosophia, a philosophy that attempts to discover what is utterly primary, precisely because they are grounded in that peculiar ambiguity which belongs to the talk of being itself. For, on the one hand, being is meant to be the comprehensive concept for all the beings that are, so that beings are primary, and being is derived from that. On the other hand, being is what is meant to recall what stands behind any and every conceptuality, what is not exhausted in concepts, what, in the language of ancient thought, exists phi sigma epsilon iota, fusi, rather than theta sigma epsilon iota, thesi. In other words, that which is not itself the result of our classifying operations of the mind, and to which priority can in turn be ascribed over against the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, or over against particular nu tau alpha, onta. It is only this ambiguity in Aristotle's question concerning the concept tau nu, ta'on, that really explains this strange turn in the argument. The explanation which Aristotle himself offers for this ambivalence, as it happens, is remarkable because it sounds incredibly modern. This is because it is the kind of explanation which effectively prevails throughout the subsequent history of Western thought wherever the philosophical problem of genesis and validity is involved. For in one place Aristotle says that the pyro tau eta omicron sigma alpha, protalgia, in the didactic sense, the first thing we become aware of, is precisely the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, whereas in itself or objectively, according to the ordo rerum, independently of the way we come to it or arise to it by way of experience, it is the actual ontological concept of being that enjoys priority. This distinction is in fact that of genesis and validity. To it is the distinction which attempts to deal with aporetic concepts, with the difficulties involved in such a central concept as being, by specifically distinguishing the process through which we come to form such concepts in the first place from the validity of these concepts as such. This is a conception that was emphatically revived by Husserl, for his theory of abstraction expressly maintains that the prior ideal unity of the species has nothing to do with the processes of abstraction through which, as thinking individuals, we actually arrive at them. Max Scheler in particular then took up this distinction and turned it into a dualism by going on to construct two worlds, a genetic empirical one and a pure ontological one, which are supposed to have nothing to do with each other, until this rather disconcerting philosophical division of labor in relation to origin and truth finally dissatisfied him so much that he turned to the vitalist metaphysics of his later period. 3. I draw this to your attention here only because this distinction between genesis and validity implicitly plays a certain role in Heidegger as well. For his work always shows a tendency to separate the nominalist moment of thought, the moment which produces concepts as abstractions from the facts which they cover, from the properly ontological level and present it as something pre-ontological. And this in spite of the fact that the point of Heidegger's project, and it is good to remember this if you wish to understand the specific difference of Heidegger's thought as the most influential form of ontology today in comparison to earlier ontological approaches, is precisely this: what Heidegger believes he has discovered in his region of being, in what he expressly addresses as being, is not a dimension of validity, a dimension of the logical in itself, which as pure logic would enjoy priority over any process of genesis. On the contrary, in one extremely perceptive passage for he has even clearly shown that logical absolutism on the one side, which turns this dimension of validity into an absolute, and psychologism along with the positivist theory of genesis on the other are essentially complementary and fit perfectly with one another. So you must actually try and understand the specific character of Heidegger's approach if you really want to understand the nature of my argument with it. For he specifically believes not only that the concept of being provides him with the ontological counterpole to the ontic domain but also that his concept of being is indeed delta iota phi omicron rho omicron sigma, eta phi eros, that it is effectively indifferent with regard to both of these dimensions, that of an absolutely fixed and objectified conceptuality and that of beings or entities included under concepts. For it is supposed to be a third perspective, though not of course a third and different sort of principle in addition to others. It is supposed to refer to an order of thought which resides in principle beyond, or, if you prefer, this side of, that dichotomy between the concept existing in itself and some mere ultimate given. Now you will sometimes encounter in Heidegger, in contrast to Husserl or to Scheler in his ontological phase, certain ways of speaking which do not really seem at home in the ontological domain, which you would sooner expect in the domain of genesis. I am thinking, for example, of the concept of origin, which plays an extraordinarily central and important role in his thought, although origin here does not refer to anything temporal within time itself. On the contrary, it is an emphatically metaphysical concept that refers to time itself as a temporalizing principle, in other words, to time itself as an ontological structure rather than to any concrete, specific or particular temporal relationship of any kind. Here too, however, it has to be said that these things remain shrouded in a kind of overwhelming ambiguity. Thus, Whenever he talks about origin and originality, this also always seems to evoke the suspicion that what lies much further back in time is somehow also more original, and therefore closer to the truth. However strongly he resists such a doctrine, his whole attack on what he later calls metaphysics, namely subject-object thinking with its objectification of thought and thing alike, can be understood only in terms of some such archaic turn in his thinking as a whole, and I believe we can say this without doing much injustice to him. If I draw your attention to this archaic moment in Heidegger's ontology here, this involves a thesis which only confirms the essential priority of such thinking over all carping, argumentative and merely rationalistic thought in the eyes of the Heidegger school, which has transformed the technique of avoiding or withdrawing from certain questions into one of consummate depth. But it is just here, in this aspect, that I have tried to point out, that you can see, if you consider this philosophy in its fully developed form, that it would clearly never endorse anything like the Platonic priority of being qua idea over the domain of beings qua tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, or tau nu tau alpha, ta anta. But at the same time you can also see, if you really consider the matter in earnest, that the pathos of this philosophy lies essentially in the contrast between being and beings. In this sense, then, it is really archaic, for the way in which being is related back to beings, as found in Aristotle's genetic explanation, is expressly repudiated by Heidegger. I would like to quote him directly here, since I regard it as an extremely important thesis, and I shall read you a relevant passage from Being and Time to substantiate this point. Now of course I am quite sure that an orthodox disciple of Heidegger, though I have no idea how he himself might respond in this connection, would argue that he has almost certainly moved beyond this way of putting things. But then the question how far the text of Being and Time can or cannot be regarded as binding for existential ontology is something that remains rather unclear. At any rate, on page 27 we read the following: "The task of ontology is to set in relief the being of beings and to explicate being itself." And the method of ontology remains questionable in the highest degree as long as we wish merely to consult the historically transmitted ontologies or similar efforts. Since the term ontology is used in a formally broad sense for this investigation, the approach of clarifying its method by tracing the history of that method is automatically precluded. Now the concluding and purely phenomenological remarks here are just good old Husserl. For there is the same negative attitude to history in any phenomenological philosophy which is dedicated to the description of essences, like that of Husserl, who once formulated one of the highest principles of his philosophy in the first volume of his Ideas for a Pure Phenomenological Philosophy in these terms: "No stories will be told here." 5 In this sense, Heidegger certainly belongs to the phenomenological tradition, although that is not the point that I want to explore here. I just want to say en passant that the whole school of Husserl, Schiller and Heidegger showed an eminently justified interest in these issues. For in the kind of socio-cultural historical investigations that built on the work of thinkers such as Wilhelm Dilthey and his school 6, the substantive questions of philosophy were marginalized or replaced by cultural historical questions as to how certain phenomena came about. In this way the question of how concepts arose, developed and passed away in turn, and the accompanying transformation of philosophy into a kind of philology, eventually came to prevail, until philosophy felt the justified need to resist this and rightly attempted to provide some kind of answer to the questions that have been inherited by philosophy itself. It may have been unnecessary for Heidegger to present these things, which were the subject of polemical debate 50 years earlier, with such tremendous pathos as if this amounted to a wholly new discovery. Yet the interest that he was responding to here seems to me quite legitimate. On the other hand, the first sentence we have just quoted demands rather close attention, and I would ask you to consider it very carefully with me. If the later Heidegger has declared 7 that we should do less philosophy and stay truer to the word itself than is usually the case today, then perhaps I may apply this principle to Heidegger himself and explore his very words in the passage in question. Thus he states that the task of ontology is to set in relief the being of beings and to explicate being itself. Now, if we assume with the tradition that ontology is the science of being, then this sounds entirely plausible. For such a science of being must distinguish its true object, namely being, from beings themselves. But once you postulate the distinctive character which Heidegger ascribes to being, this apparently quite sound methodological demand on the part of the ontologist is by no means as self-evident as it first seems. For if being itself is neither a pure concept nor any specific being, then the relationship of being to beings belongs thematically to this concept of being itself as what is intrinsically involved in it. But if instead it is already decided, or pre-decided, that being is absolutely different from beings, or is separated from beings by an ontological gulf, then this is begging the question, as they say in English, or committing a petitio principii, to use the apt Latin phrase. In other words, it actually assumes what is supposed to emerge from the ontological analysis in the first place, namely, in what way being relates to beings, whether it is essential to being to become beings, whether being is mediated with reference to beings or is wholly other than beings, whether being constitutes a unity with respect to beings or is something else again. All of these problems, which would really have to form the serious content of any philosophy of being, are already decided, as if by decree, with this seemingly reasonable and plausible statement of Heidegger's before the analysis has actually been undertaken. In other words, we are informed in advance that the task is to explicate being and to set the being of beings into relief. Now this is all very well and good, but what if part of the meaning of being is that it cannot absolutely be set off against beings? What if, on the contrary, beings as such belong to the meaning of being, as is clearly suggested by the predicament of ancient philosophy that I have already outlined for you? How can I then establish in advance the methodological principle that being must be separated from beings? For in effect this anticipates, and indeed with a somewhat threatening gesture, what can only result from the analysis we have been promised, namely the contrast of being and beings. And this postulate, incidentally, implies a kind of ontological objectification or solidification of being over against beings of the sort that Heidegger specifically repudiates in his critique of metaphysics. Indeed, this critique insists that we should not understand the concept of being in this way merely as a counter-concept to beings and should recognize instead that it lies outside or beyond this alternative. I have presented things in the way that I have in order to show you how this kind of thinking, if we take what it asks of us really seriously, that is, if we just try to think along with it, certainly lacks the rigor and plausibility it claims and faces the most serious methodological objections. and I believe that we have shown as much. Now I would like to point out that the question of the relationship between tau nu, ta'on, and tau nu tau alpha, ta anta, is a principal theme in Husserl's thought, and that Heidegger shows himself to be a faithful student of Husserl in this regard, for the whole priority of the doctrine of being, the doctrine of universal concepts or the ideal unity of the species, as Husserl puts it, is also something taught by Husserl. Here too the individual fact as the tau delta epsilon tau iota, tau t, he even uses this Aristotelian expression, as the actual individuated being presented in the context of time and space, is contrasted with what he calls essence, although this is not interpreted in terms of its highest concept. Now Heidegger's method actually reflects this shared outlook, and I think it is really important for us to be clear about this, for I neglected to mention this point before and it needs to be emphasized here. For the method of Heidegger, at least at the level of being and time, professes to be a phenomenological one. Here I quote from Being and Time, "Ontology is possible only as phenomenology." And he continues, "The phenomenological concept of phenomenon, as self-showing, means the being of beings, its meaning, modifications, and derivatives. If you translate that into Husserlian terms, you have a proposition that Husserl would probably endorse. The task of phenomenology in Husserl's sense is to address the thing purely in its own right, precisely as it presents itself, and ignore as far as possible any further contribution or ingredient, if I may put it like that, on the part of thought. In other words, we must cultivate a passively receptive or intuitive mode of comportment and abandon ourselves completely to the things themselves, thereby discovering a source of indubitable certainty such as we find in the realm of immediate sensory givenness. Now I cannot go into the problems of this theory here but must simply refer you, if you will allow me, to a book which I once wrote about these issues and which I have no desire to go over again right now. I am talking about the Metacritique of Epistemology, which, especially in the final chapter, challenges the possibility of categorical intuition in this sense. 9 When Husserl talks of the being of beings, what he means is nothing more than this: when I see an instance of red, such as the red blouse of the lady in the third row, what is given to my intuition is not just this specific red blouse but redness as such. In other words, this intuition of a particular color exemplifies the species red itself, even if I cannot see any other red blouses in the room which would allow me to recognize redness as a common feature here. 10 I hope you will forgive the triviality of the example. The fact that phenomenology must always appeal to such banal examples is rather symptomatic, as I see it, for this sort of philosophy itself, and I would therefore ask you not to lay this at my door. Thus to become aware of the being of beings, for Husserl, is quite simply this: when I see a given red I elevate the redness from this red, as it were, instead of restricting my attention to this limited individuated case of red. But the really decisive twist that Heidegger furnishes here is this: whereas Husserl treats this redness in an entirely innocuous logical fashion, namely as the quintessence of all conceivable shades of red, it is now turned into something independent, is made into a kind of being in itself that gives itself to me. Now up to a certain point, and these things are very subtle, this is already prefigured in classical phenomenology, whose method is indeed accepted by Heidegger, as the passage I have quoted indicates. For Husserl says that, if I look at the red blouse, even if, God forbid, there were no other red blouse in the entire world, and no other case of red either, I would still be able to intuit the essence red or redness from this single instance. Now if that were really true, and this is the reason I have been so emphatic on this point against Husserl and expended so much effort on all this, then Heidegger's thought that some form of being sui generis, of being in its own right, namely the form of being redness, is prior to any particular given red would be plausible. For if there is no such redness in itself, how could I speak of this redness and immediately perceive this redness when I have only a single example in front of me? The move from the immediate perceptibility of this redness towards the being in itself of redness, and then, by extension of this method, the move towards the effective independence of being itself with respect to particular beings, is an extraordinarily tempting conclusion. But then, as I would say, it was not really all so bad in Husserl, if you will excuse this rather crude way of putting it. It is certainly true that Husserl liked to talk about ontology, and indeed frequently did so, but what he meant by ontology was basically nothing but the attempt to epitomize the highest regions of specific fields and determine their internal structure. Thus if I consider the highest concepts to which mathematics can aspire, or those of theoretical physics, of pure grammar or of pure logic, and he was always fundamentally interested in pure logic and pure mathematics, and bring these concepts together and determine their structure, their interconnection, their mutual dependence, and so on, then for Husserl that would be the relevant ontology. And this ontology is located in each case within the domain of an already established and developed science which can be related, through reflection on its logical structure, to a certain number of ultimate general concepts, those concepts without which it is allegedly impossible to conceive of the region in question. But it would never have occurred to Husserl that these general logical principles or logically articulated material regions, for which he already introduced the term ontology, would enjoy any sort of absolute independence or would possess a truly ontological character, in other words, that they represented anything more than the structures of the individual sciences and needed justification as ontologies in their own right. And, as soon as Schiller attempted to reinterpret these formal logical elements that pertain to individual fields into an ontological doctrine of being in itself, Husserl was utterly mortified. As in the story of the sorcerer's apprentice, he now exerted all his efforts to quell the spirits he had himself unleashed. And he did so by referring the question concerning the constitution of the individual sciences, and thus also the constitution of the relevant ontologies, right back to the transcendental subject. In other words, Husserl subjected this question to the judgment of reason and thus effectively returned to traditional idealism, while his successors went on to turn the ontology he had conceived in a merely provisional way into ontology in the emphatic sense. If you are to understand more clearly the transformation involved in the more recent history of the concept of ontology, it is important to see how this talk of ontology, how the recourse to ontology through the analysis of meaning within already constituted regions, was accomplished by Husserl, but also how he ultimately referred the question of constitution, of the derivation and justification of these regions and ontologies, back to reason in a quite traditional Kantian way. But this relationship between ontology and subjectivity is subsequently reversed. In Husserl these ontologies, these provisional expressions of the highest classificatory concepts for the particular domains they encompass, are still referred to critical reason, that is, to subjectivity. In his successors, on the other hand, we find the exact opposite. In other words, the categories of subjectivity and constitutive reason are now supposed to depend on the relevant ontologies, namely on the ontological structures which for Husserl were merely secondary and derived in character. And it is this transition that actually defines the turn to ontological philosophy. Though we have to say, and I want you to be really clear about this, that the doctrine of categorical intuition, the notion that we can become aware of something categorical or conceptual in an immediate way, already suggests that being itself could also belong to something as categorical, as conceptual, as being ultimately is. And that is why Husserl, with complete consistency, came to subject this idea of categorical intuition to increasing restrictions and effectively demoted it to a merely transitional stage within experience. If we look closely at Husserl's doctrine of categorical intuition, on which the whole of the ensuing ontological development depends, we see that it actually leaves little trace in his own thought. Ladies and gentlemen, I showed you that, in spite of an attempted original return to the question of being, ontology treats being as what is prior with respect to beings. Let me just close today by offering a thesis which I shall develop in the next session. This is that, once again, we discover here a necessary aporia in this philosophy. For if the priority of being with respect to all beings is not defended in the way that ontological philosophy undertakes to do, then a doctrine of being is not actually possible at all. A pure ontology, a doctrine of being as such, is only possible if being is taken to be independent of particular spatio-temporal beings. This doctrine of pure being, at this level of universality, cannot possibly be carried through in any other way, for otherwise it would inevitably have to refer back to something determinate, particular and individual for its significant content. And it would thereby expressly forfeit that character that belongs to it of the chi omega rho sigma, chorus, of that separation from all individual, random and finite things. This seems to me the really decisive issue which has led to the hypostasis of the concept of being. And that is precisely what I shall try to show in detail in our next session. Lecture 7.